What's up, guys? Today we're gonna talk about the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War, well, it actually, started in. Hold up. Sorry about that. We're gonna go a little bit of background history before that, all right? So, going back to the 1800s, in what is called Indochina, which includes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They were fighting, and then suddenly the French colonists came in and started invading them. Even though they attempted to fight back, well, obviously they failed because they didn't have guns, they didn't have airships, and they had new tactics which worked better against their old-fashioned ones. So in the end, in the 1850s, 1860s, French Indochina was made. All right, and they held onto that for. Sorry for the disturbance. It was my grandma. Now, they held on to it for about maybe a century. All right, but then in 1950s, Vietnam started fighting for independence, which actually, they fought twice, right? Because Japan during World War II, occupied French Indochina, and they fought back. But then France reclaimed its colonies, and Vietnam, didn't like that because they fought for their independence against Japan. They didn't want to be French again, so they said, okay, what? Screw it, we're declaring independence, all right? And of course, that led to the Indochina Wars. So that's between French, which is backed by U.S., versus Vietnam, which is backed by the Chinese and Soviet Union's governments. All right, the war lasted until 1964, which was when France surrendered. Well, during that, the Treaty of Paris, actually, Vietnam was split in half. All right, so there was the South, which was backed by France and the U.S., and North Vietnam, which is obviously still backed by China and the Soviet Union. And obviously, the Vietnamese still didn't like that because, we fought for our independence. You lost, and we have to split our territory in half? That's not going to work. So that starts the Vietnam War that we know, right? So that's the second part, because the Vietnam War is considered from 1954 to 1975, about 20-year period or so. But the U.S. and the other part came in 1963. All right, so at that time, President Nixon, maybe President Nixon was in office. All right, he was like, okay, let's do this war thing, and start backing the South and sending more troops there. And obviously, there was war going on during in the border of North and South from Vietnam. The war lasted pretty long. All right, even without the back half, French versus Vietnamese, U.S. However, the U.S. also had a lot of allies. The U.S. had South Koreans, Australians, New Zealanders, Europeans. There were a lot of groups fighting against communism because these were like U.S. allies or satellite states. You think about it. They're very aligned with U.S.'s bloc or intentions. So they used a lot of weapons. Was it Agent Orange, which killed a lot of trees and made a lot of birth defects. My grandma is one of the victims of those birth defects actually. Bombs were dropped on Laos and Vietnam, which today are still there. In Laos, so many bombs were dropped. They built houses on deactivated or broken bombs. All right, that's showing you how much bombs the U.S. dropped, because Laos was also had a communist uprising, and Vietnamese supported it just so they can do the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which led straight into South Vietnam. Now, after a while, however, the Watergate scandal during the early 1970s, however, he resigned, and new president came in, and they started withdrawing U.S. troops. All right, because a lot of troops were people were like, okay, why does my teenage son have to go into Vietnam and then die for this cause? We don't want that. So the public turned against the government. So the government was like, okay, we can't let this go on any longer. So after the Watergate scandal, where Nixon was like caught trying to steal sneaky stuff, new presidents came in. All right, I don't know who came after Nixon. Oh, Gerald Ford. Or Gerald Ford, he pulled U.S. troops and attempted to help South Vietnamese try and push back using their own men, but with U.S. aid. However, that was a little bit too late because it happened in 1973. 3 years later, North Vietnamese troops stormed Saigon, and they liberated by crashing a tank through the gates and then raising their flag. However, that doesn't mean the Vietnam War has actually ended in a sense. All right, the Vietnam War ended. The aftermath is still there. All right, the Vietnamese economy went down. All right, even today, 26,000 Vietnamese dong equals $1 US. There were a lot of people who were born with birth defects, people who were was mutilated, people who died because of communist raids commenced by the South Vietnamese government and U.S. Soldiers. A lot of things happened, and well, obviously that led to the Khmer Rouge, right? Because well, a lot of bombs and you became communist in the end. Well, that also led to the Cambodian War, and then later the Chinese War on North. All right. So in the end, yep, war is hell, and it leads to more war. So yeah, that's all I had to say. Thank you for listening to me ranting about my nation's history for a reason. Goodbye. See you next time.